I want to thank my friend and Dharma brother, Gary Gach, G-A-C-H, who's a Buddhist writer that you should know, for urging me to talk about the precepts. So, Buddhism is a big tent, and not all Buddhists meditate. Not all Buddhists shave their heads. Not all Buddhists wear robes. Not all Buddhists marry. But all Buddhists follow the refuges, the three refuges, and the precepts. And I wanted to talk about them today. So what's a precept? A precept is a guide for moderating behavior. It's not a commandment. If you think about the 10 Commandments, they begin with a very authoritarian command, thou shalt have no God before me, other than me. So it immediately creates, there are other gods, but I'm the most important one, and I'm the one you have to deal with. And there's a sense of command, authority, and power coming from on high, and there's also a sense of division in that very first commandment. There's you, and there's God, and then there's other gods, and he's like a general. He's going to order the troops. Well, that's one story about the world. The Bible was not sent down to earth by fax. It was passed from hand to hand, from mouth to ear by fallible humans. The King James Bible was rewritten during the time of Shakespeare by a committee. I think of it like the Warren Committee. There were books that were decided that were orthodox. There were books that were decided they were not to be in it. But the Buddhist precepts are quite different because Buddhists don't really hold that there's a God separate from all creation and that exists as an ultimate authority. For Buddhism, the universe is one seamless, interactive event. And despite the apparent singularity of what the Chinese used to call the 10,000 things, the world of trees and birds and insects and mountain ranges and dolphins and leopards, none of them can exist independently. They can't exist without oxygen. They can't exist without sunlight. They can't exist without microbes in the soil that either grow the plants that feed us or feed rabbits, feed the prey of lions and tigers. So it's equally true to say that nothing exists singularly, that the appearance of singular existence is kind of a delusion, or at least it's only half the equation. So the precepts relate to our conduct in the world, how we think and what we do. We could also state that they kind of represent the gap between what we know and what we do. So in the West, we have metaphysics on one hand and we have ethics on the other hand. Metaphysics represent the ultimate truth, and a lot of energy goes into figuring out what the ultimate truth is, and then our conduct is something else again. But by the end of the 20th century, a lot of thinkers were beginning to question whether or not there was any metaphysical truth outside of the actual facts of our daily living. And this is something that Buddha was thinking about actively 3,000 years ago. I say 3,000 because I recently read an article that excavations in Nepal and India have pushed Buddhism back another 500 years. So we don't, in Buddhist practice, we don't hold that there's some primary truth over here and some kind of ethical behavior over here. Our conduct is the truth. What we do is what we believe. If we don't like what we do, we can change it. But ultimately, we're not being given a commandment. Each of these precepts has 3 levels. I'll talk about those levels in a minute. So let's talk about the refuges first. Then I'll talk about the precepts. So there are 3 refuges in Buddha that everyone says. Do this usually every morning or in any ceremony. The first one is, I take refuge in the Buddha. This doesn't mean that I honor a dead person. This doesn't mean that I'm giving myself over to a statue or an idol. What it means is I take refuge in the principle of enlightenment, which is the Buddha within us. Because the one thing that Buddha stressed over and over again is that we're all enlightened. It's the nature of human consciousness. The bright knowing screen on which all our thoughts are projected and fantasies are projected, that bright knowing screen is the eye that was the eye of the Buddha. And if we forget that, we're basically consigning Buddha to a grave somewhere, as a has-been, as a once was. But when we remember that, then Buddha and all the bodhisattvas come to life. We are Buddhas. We are Buddhas when we behave like Buddhas. We're Buddhas when we perceive like Buddhas, when we think like Buddhas. So I take refuge in the Buddha. Means I believe in and I pursue enlightened states of mind, enlightened action, enlightened living. And when I do that, that's my Buddha nature. But it's not personal. I take refuge in the Buddha. Refuge from what? Refuge from delusion. Refuge from fantasies. Refuge from terror. Refuge from suffering. Refuge is a shelter. It's a protection. So I take refuge from the buffets of daily life, from the lack of discipline in my own mind, from the consequences of my past behavior. I take refuge in enlightenment. That's the Buddha. And you are the Buddha. You are enlightened. But all of us have what are called kleshas, dark thoughts, dark impulses, obscure, ungenerous, unkind, unloving impulses, which block us from seeing our own enlightenment. And one of the reasons that we meditate is to become intimate with those things, so we can let them loose on the spirits of mind, energy. They can come in and they can go out. We don't have to be afraid to receive them if we're not afraid to let them go. So the second refuge is I take refuge in the Dharma. So Dharma are the facts of reality, and Dharma is also the teaching of the Buddha. So when we say I take refuge in the Dharma, we're acknowledging the wisdom and the compassion of a bodhisattva's way of life. And a bodhisattva is one who exists to help others. The bodhisattvas represent a great achievement in human thought. I'm sure we've all been in communities where there's either some kind of spiritual practice or some kind of political practice going on where people are struggling for power and struggling to reach the top so they can turn around and help other people. The Bodhisattva said, I'll go last. I'll accept enlightenment when the last person is enlightened. So they dedicate themselves to helping others. And that dedication itself comes from great clarity and great seeing, because when you see clearly the interconnections between your own life and everything else, it creates spontaneously an arising of compassion and love, tenderness. The ideas about life are kind of like artificial flowers. Nobody has really great emotional attachment to them. But real flowers are precious because they're always in the process of change. They're dying. They're passing away. And you can extend that to every living thing. And so if you can see even your enemies, even people you don't like, as passing, as a temporary expression of the entire universe. Just like you, they run from what they're afraid of. Just like me, they run toward what they like. They have personal history that tends to run them around. And they suffer from their mistakes, just like us. So to seek a way of life that is generous and open and loving toward all creation has to include all people, which means to some degree we surrender the easy access to judgment, which always implies that we're in the correct place and the people we're judging are in the wrong place. There's no dialogue that comes from that. There's no understanding. So the third refuge is I take refuge in the Sangha. And Sangha just means the followers of this way of life, the followers of the Buddha's teaching. So I take refuge in the Buddha, the principle of enlightenment within us. I take refuge in the Dharma. I acknowledge the wisdom and compassion of an enlightened way of life and an enlightened way of understanding and living. And I take refuge in the community of people who live this way. I once picked up a hitchhiker back in the 60s when I was coming en route from San Rafael to Olima in my old truck. There was a little short guy carrying a starter motor wearing a shell cap. He was hitchhiking, so I picked him up. And he began to talk to me about communes. He began to ask me questions about them because he had heard about the Olima commune where I was living. And his questions were very shrewd. And in about 10 minutes, I realized I was sort of out of my depth. This guy had been thinking more deeply than I about a whole host of issues and things. So we talked until I got to the place where he was going to get off. And as he was leaving, he was standing on the ground, holding my truck door open, and he looked at me and he said, "Don't show your lamb to wolves. It's an invitation to get eaten." And I was really shocked. I said, "Well, who do you show your lamb to?" And he smiled and he said, "To people who are interested in the workings of the universe." He shut the door and walked away. So that's how I think about the Sangha. They're brothers and sisters who are dedicated to getting to the bottom of things, to seeing clearly. So after the three refuges, there are what are called the three pure precepts. The first is to do no evil. Well, evil is kind of a Christian translation. Buddhists don't talk about evil a great deal because in a world where we don't have a fixed self, behavior is much more important than this idea of a fixed identity, which gets us in a lot of trouble. So evil seems like it could be a recognizable, graspable thing. In fact, it's a word, and everybody has a different definition of it. The original meaning of the word in Sanskrit was akusala, which meant unskillful. And unskillful always related to enlightenment. If you were living for the benefit of others, and if you were trying to be helpful to others, behavior which harmed them, threatened them, frightened them, was unskillful. So that's the first one, to do no evil. I vow to avoid all action that creates suffering and all actions that create self-clinging. clinging to the idea of a fixed self. I vow to refrain from causing harm to myself, to others, to animals, to plants, to the earth, the waters, the air. It's all one thing, folks. To do no evil. Now, ultimately, all these precepts, they have a surface meaning, they have an inner meaning, and then they have a kind of ultimate meaning. The surface meaning, I vow to avoid action that creates suffering. That's pretty clear. But it's up to you to decide, isn't it? And that takes you directly to the ultimate meaning. Because all of these precepts are organized, adjudicated, and motivated by a Buddhist heart and a Buddhist understanding. And that's your heart and your understanding. So ultimately, we're in negotiation with these precepts. We have to be very careful that we don't let ourselves off the hook. Well, that's not a big deal to me, stepping on a spider, rescuing a bee out of the water, being a little caustic to someone. But there's no God to judge you in Buddhist theology. So ultimately, your Buddhist heart, your enlightened mind, if you can stay quiet enough to listen to it, will instruct you what to do. The second one is to do good. Good is another one of those words. It's not evil. It has a broad range of meaning. In Sanskrit, it was kusala, which meant skillful. Which meant skillful in terms of living to help others. So one of the great philosophical breakthroughs in Buddhism was, for the first 400 or 500 years, people were very concentrated on their own enlightenment. And we call that today Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. Then about 400 or 500 years after Buddha passed, people began to say, oh, no, wait a minute, we've got to bring everyone with us. And that impulse to save all beings became known as Mahayana Buddhism. Big vehicle. So I vow to do good. I vow to be skillful. I vow to be continuous at this work, to do all actions that create true happiness, to live in clarity and in truth, to uncover within myself loving kindness, compassion, and equanimity of our awakened nature. Everything comes from being in contact with this awakened nature. It's not going to come off my cell phone. It's not going to come from reading an article. It's not going to come even from my teaching or more skillful teachers' teaching. Ultimately, it's going to be adjudicated by your own awareness and your own dedication to living a life of service and kindness and helpfulness. And the third pure precept is, I vow to save all beings. In other words, I vow to live for the benefit of all beings. It's not like I'm bringing you the good news and I want to awaken you to the true God who's out there. I want you to see your own nature. And I vow to help you do that in whatever way I can. Okay. So to save all being also means to offer people the opportunity to discover and express their own awakened nature. It's not an edict that we impose on them. It's not a right way. We do have forms in Buddhist practice. I've talked a lot about the form of sitting zazen. But we say we have a formal practice and an informal mind. So the mind remains soft and supple and fluid. And disciplining the body is one way to remove extraneous impulses. One way to remove excitement from the mind and allowing the mind to kind of slow down so it doesn't create fogs of dialogue and grudges and envies and affections and passions that obscure that bright knowing awareness which is like the depths of the ocean. It doesn't change at all. So we may not get through all of these today because I was so late at starting. But I'm going to start, and if we don't, I'll pick it up on the next. So these are the 10 grave precepts, and these are for disciples of the Buddha. And I should say that these came from a series of edicts that were called the Vinaya, and they were the rules of Buddhist temples. And there used to be 250 precepts for monks, and there was 348 precepts for nuns. The Mahayana tradition has resolved that down to around 16. So I'm going to start. So the first one is, I vow to not kill. Another way to say it is, a disciple of the Buddha does not kill. This is the first commandment. It's the sixth commandment in Judeo-Christian tradition. Comes after not coveting your neighbor's wife and holding no God before me. And this is the very first one. I vow to not kill. So that's the superficial meaning of it. It's probably impossible to get through life without killing. But still, that's our intention. And you have to negotiate for yourself whether you're going to let someone else kill the animals you eat, or whether cutting broccoli is killing. I can't tell you. I can tell you what I do. But these precepts have to be moderated because your conduct will be your enlightenment. The way you behave will be your enlightenment. And we say always, put no head above your own. So that means when your head is clear and when it's calm, it'll tell you everything you need to know. All the answers are right there. So in the realm of the Dharma, the interior expression of this precept is you don't give rise to the idea of killing. You cut thoughts of anger. You cut thoughts of vengefulness. You cut thoughts of envy. You cut them off. You cut them off by letting them go. When you meditate, you recognize what comes up. We don't react to it. We just see it. And if we don't react to it, if we don't grab it, it just goes. So it comes and goes. So the idea of not killing is a germ that starts within, in thoughts. Now, physical violence and abusive behavior, like threats, extreme displays of anger and maliciousness are also a kind of killing. They kill peace, they kill the clarity of others, they kill silence, they kill friendship. So once again, we have to decide for ourselves, how do I do this? How do I negotiate this? The second is, a disciple of the Buddha does not steal. And the corollary of that is to practice the perfection of giving. So stealing's pretty clear. You don't take what's not given. That's the superficial aspect of it. But the deeper, more internal aspect is coming from thoughts of gaining. You have everything you need. What do you need to gain? And what do you need to gain enough to take what's not given? Well, I can think of circumstances. I can think of people stealing to feed their children. I'm not going to judge them. I might judge the system that doesn't share equitably. But once again, you have to decide in your own nature by your intuitions. Buddhism is a very intuitive practice. You know, the world is so complex. It's so interdependent that logic is not a suitable instrument for negotiating it on some levels. And intuition is a far older aspect of mind. It includes emotion, memory, and intellect. And it lights up huge areas of the brain. It's directly relative to our success as a species. So in all of these things, you have to consult your own Buddha nature. The Bodhisattva makes a commitment to live from a generous heart. He already has the entire universe. You can also see how misusing status and authority, when you have power over someone, is a form of stealing. So once again, we open these things up. We keep them on the back burner in our mind. We refer to them to judge our own conduct. A disciple of the Buddha does not misuse sexuality. It's a pretty open statement. It doesn't say sex is bad. It doesn't say sex is immoral. It says it can be misused. And then the corollary of that is to honor the body, one's own body, the body of your lover, and also good faith in relationships. No veneers. No veneers of having more affection than you do for someone else. So in the realm of the Dharma, not creating a veneer of attachment is called the precept of not misusing sex. In other words, we don't pretend that we like someone more than we do to sleep with them. That's a misuse. It's not the sleeping, it's not the sex, but the pretense. Causing harm to self or others through the way we express our sexual energy. We have to decide. For instance, continued expression of sexual interest after someone's told us they're not interested. It's a misuse of sex. You know, if I keep trying, maybe she'll say yes. It's not respectful. It's a misuse of someone else's space and privacy, even though you've never touched them. So also, in order to avoid unintentional harm, we have to also consider what is the impact my sexuality is going to have on another person. I have to take responsibility for that. It's not just getting what I want. And especially if you're in a community, what's the impact going to be on the community? I was a member of a Buddhist community that was riven and racked with pain because of the inappropriate sexual behavior of the senior teacher. Practically destroyed that community and caused much pain to many, many people. It's really tricky to stay on top of testosterone. I know that. But when we begin to practice a spiritual life, these are the things we agree to do. And it seems to me to make good sense that we trust enlightenment as an ultimate teacher rather than some physical authority who will have their own karma and their own history and their own problems. So in Buddhist practice, our teachers are not exactly, at least in Zen practice, our teachers are not gurus. They're more like elder aunts and uncles who've been down this road ahead of us, and they offer their advice. And we take it or leave it. When we bow to a teacher or when we bow to a statue of the Buddha, it's often misunderstood as an expression of sacred relationships to something higher than we are. In fact, we're vowing to wisdom. We're bowing and honoring our own inner wisdom, as well as the Buddha's, and the continuity of clarity and wisdom on earth in different traditions. Buddhism is not the only owner of clarity and wisdom and kindness.